Wednesday is always our audio day, and we are delighted to have this amazing expert audio panel assembled. It's a great opportunity for all of our listeners to learn something about the technical issues that accompany the recording, editing, and processing of sound in all of your digital creations. Today, our topic is going to be oversampling. This is a technical issue that you will be able to kind of hopefully get your mind more around here. And for the start off, we're going to toss things to Jeff Francis, who can define it and help us kind of get into the basics. Jeff, take over.
So, we're going to nerd out about a really technical subject, and if everyone gets really sleepy and bored, we'll just cut it short. But so oversampling is different than higher sampling rates. Let's be clear about that. Oversampling is something that happens in converters on the way to normal sampling rates, and it happens in plugins. So brief, quick review of sampling, right? We start with, here's my little squiggly line. There's a representation of analog audio. Why is it squiggly? Because it's got ultrasonic frequencies, stuff we can't hear. The very first thing that needs to happen is we need to remove frequencies above half the sampling rate, above Nyquist. So if we're talking 48K, we need to remove everything 24K and above. We'll talk about aliasing in a second. And then we sample that, and we end up with this signal, which is our sampled signal. And of course, we quantize. We take a number that is the amplitude of each of those, and those will usually be a 24-bit number. So that gives us 16 million levels. And that's this little dotted line there. And then, when we go back to analog, because we never, ever hear a digital signal, we always convert it back to analog because we're analog people. We reconstruct, and we're back to a nice smooth line of all of our audio. So what's aliasing? If something comes in above Nyquist, Nyquist is that half the sampling rate number. So if we're talking 48K, anything above 24 kilohertz cannot be represented in a 48K system. So if that signal comes in, and we have some audio that's too high in frequency, above 24 kilohertz, it still gets sampled. But when it gets sampled as something that is actually lower in frequency. So it appears in our audio, even though it came in. So if it came in as 30 kilohertz, it comes out as 18 kilohertz. 6K above the sampling rate comes out as 6K below the sampling rate. Visually, this is really easy to see. Hopefully this video actually plays. There you go. So
there you go.
That is, this strange helicopter that, how is it flying? Well, it happens that the frame rate of the camera and the spinning of the rotors match up. And that's the same thing with audio aliasing, is we get audio that comes in below into the audio band. So the problem is, oversampling is the solution to how do we keep out frequencies above 24 kilohertz. And the ideal is that we let everything from 0 to 24 kilohertz come in just beautifully fine and flat and unaffected. And everything from 24 kilohertz above needs to be removed. So we're looking for that perfect brick wall low-pass filter that lets audio up to one frequency, 24 kilohertz, come through at unity gain and then immediately stops. And all the audio from 24.000001 kilohertz all the way to infinity is gone. Now, building that in an analog filter is near impossible. And that's why early digital didn't sound great, is because the anti-alias filters were hard to build. And they needed to be, in our normal audio systems, we're talking about fourth order, 24 dB per octave filters, but we need, huge, greater than 100 dB per octave filters here. So what oversampling does is says, let's, hang on, I'm just looking for a slide here. Let's not try to do that in the analog domain. Let's remove ultrasonic stuff with a gentle, very, very gentle anti-alias filter. So let's take out everything, above 1 megahertz. That's a piece of cake. We can get rid of stuff 1 megahertz and above. And then we're going to go and we're going to sample, but we're going to sample really fast. And this is why it's called oversampling, because we're aiming for 48 kilohertz, but we're going to actually, in the process of getting there, we're going to sample 256 times that at like 12 megahertz. So, our gentle low-pass filter is fine to keep out alias frequencies if we're sampling at 12 megahertz. But we can't do 12 megahertz accurately. So much like everything in computers, much like Apple's computational photography in the iPhone, we are trading speed for accuracy. Instead of doing something slow and accurate, we're going to do it crude, but really, really fast. And then we're going to trade that speed for accuracy later in math, in the digital domain. So we sampled this thing very crudely. And when I say crudely, I mean 4 bits of accuracy. 4 bits of accuracy is horrible dynamic range, right? 24 bits is 144 dB of dynamic range, louds to softs, huge range, as big as our human hearing. 4 bits is 24 dB. Imagine the noisiest audio system you've ever heard. And that's what we're doing, but we're doing it really fast. And then we're going to trade and we're going to decimate. Decimate means we're going to come back down in frequency from that 12 megahertz down 256 times to 48K. And we're going to end up now at a 48K signal. And at the same time, we're going to do a digital, perfect, almost perfect, brick wall filter. And now we're going to remove everything from 24 kilohertz up to 1 megahertz or beyond with that beautiful digital brick wall filter in the process of math. And in that math, we're going to capture the accuracy that we got by trading that speed for accuracy. And so we'll come out at 48K 24-bit. I'm going to show you first like what 4 times oversampling looks like, because trying to show this on a graph with 256 times, it gets way too small. So what do you see down? You see down on the left side of this graph, you see audio, right? There's the audio frequencies up to 24 kilohertz and beyond, the stuff we can't hear. And now, why is there these duplicates? Well, that's a process of sampling. Sampling is a periodic signal, and when you get a periodic signal, you get overtones. And so sampling is periodic, so there are overtones at multiples of the sampling frequency. Also, why is there negative frequency? That's a thing that electrical engineers do to represent phase, as they represent both plus and negative frequency, and that's how they can express phase. And you see that green is a very gentle slope of our initial analog anti-alias filter. And since we're doing high oversampling, we've moved the first harmonics above, way beyond. And then our decimation will look something like that little red brick wall filter. All right, so I'm going to stop there for a moment for anyone that else wants to jump in and discuss, and if not, we'll move on to the big question of, isn't it really noisy? Because if we're doing a 4-bit converter, we've got 24 dB of dynamic range, and yes, it is very noisy. But where
Jeff, I'm curious, are all oversampling systems done exactly the same way? Is there differences in the approach that different engineers take to oversampling to get this accomplished? Or is this kind of a physics thing that's always the same for all implementations?
I will say that all modern analog to digital conversion uses oversampling.
Okay.
Do they all use 256 times? Not necessarily. The thing that remember, if you then change your converter, your system from 48K to 96, the converter is still converting at 12 megahertz. It's now just 12 megahertz, but it's only 128 times oversampling because you've changed what your base frequency is. So the converters always convert at the same frequency, and then there's the math changes to give you a different sampling rate coming out.
Great. Marty, you had a weigh in?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, so when you're doing a digital sample, you're taking samples at a regular period. So, one sample every so many milliseconds. Once you have that, you really can't ever improve on that because you only have that information at each sample. So if you're sampling at a low rate initially, you mentioned, I think, was it 4 megahertz per second? Or four, what was it? What was your first sampling rate?
48 kilohertz is what we call baseband. That's what we're looking for.
In the anti-aliasing filter.
What was the oversampling rate, in other words?
Oversampling will do 256 times that. But the quantization is a low amount of bits, number of bits per sample.
Oh, right. So it's a low bit rate. So how is that? How do you then get 48 more bits out of it later if you've originally done your sampling at a low bit rate?
Right. So it's a low number of it's the bit depth. The number of bits per sample is very low, which equates to, you're exactly right, terrible quality audio, low dynamic range. It's very noisy. But the thing is to remember is that noise, that error in the quantization is not from 0 to 24 kilohertz. It's from 0 to 6 megahertz. So the noise power is spread out over a huge bandwidth. And all we care about is 0 to 24 kilohertz. So the error, there's lots of error in the quantization, but much of the error is ultrasonic. So now you have to stick with me because oversampling gives us an advantage. And I like to talk about quality in terms of bits, dynamic range quality, right? Everyone has an idea about 24-bit. And remember, the real easy math, it's not exact, but it's a great rule of thumb, is 6 dB per bit. If you have 10-bit audio, you got 60 dB of dynamic range. If you have 24-bit audio, you have 144 dB of dynamic range. So there's an equation, and it's basically each octave, each doubling of oversampling yields a half a bit of improvement. Okay, which, so it gets you 3 dB of improvement, which is some improvement, but not a lot, because you think, 256 times, that's a lot, but 256 times is only 8 doublings, right? So you only get 4 bits of improvement. You get 24 bits. So it's still not 24 dB. So if you do a 4-bit converter at 256 times, you're still only talking about 8-bit audio. So it doesn't help. So there is something that comes to the rescue of that, and that is a thing called noise shaping. Noise shaping is essentially a feedback loop of the noise. Because our audio is slow compared to our 12 megahertz sampler, we can do a feedback loop to move the noise up into the ultrasonic region. So this little graph shows first order, second order, third order, and fourth order noise shaping. And remember that FS in this case, in the bottom right hand, that's 12 megahertz. So the center of the graph is 6 megahertz. And way down in the left side of the audio is what we're worried about. And so the little dashed line that says no noise shaping, that's the noise of just the converter itself. But now, down here, we're pushing the noise in the audio band lower and lower and lower and lower, and we're shoving it all up in the ultrasonic band, which is going to get removed by our digital brick wall limiter. And that's the magic of oversampling converters, is noise shaping. Because each order of noise shaping adds to that half a bit that you get through oversampling. First order gives you 1.5, second order gives you 2.5, third order gives you 3.5. So if you have third order noise shaping with 8 doublings or 256 times oversampling, now you're looking at 3.5 bits times 4. And that's how you get these huge numbers of dynamic range. That's how you can get 24 bits out of there. Hang on, I just closed my slide here. Does that answer that, Marty?
Example of 48 kilohertz audio. I imagine that it's even more significant when you're doing something like 44.1, right?
Usually all that happens is the 12 megahertz conversion just moves down to 11.2 or 11.8, whatever it is. It's 256 times 44.1. So it's just whatever that base, that's why it's called oversampling, because we always really deal with the 48 kilohertz number, and we talk about 256 times that. This is one of the penalties of going to higher sampling rates, is you actually do allow more quantization noise through. Now it's spread out over a broader range because now you're dealing with all the way to 48 kilohertz if you go to 96K, but you've given up some of your oversampling quality.
Bottom line, audio is complicated, guys. It always amazed me back in the early days when I thought, oh, my audio signals should be so much easier and they should take up so much less room than all my complicated video signals. And boy, I got my comeuppance when I started realizing that there was a boatload of processing that needed to be done to keep this stuff straight and sounding good.
Yeah, so if third order noise shaping in a 256 times oversampling converter, each of those doublings, which are 8 doublings to get 256 times, each of those 8 doublings gives you 3.5 bits of improvement. That's 28 bits plus your original 4 bits. Now you have the potential quality of 32 bits. And now you're dealing with the quality of your analog input stage is actually your limiting factor. So this is how we get converters that claim to be 24-bit. Now,
Mickey,
we have to do a whole lot of math to get out of there. Go ahead, Bill.
No, I just think Mickey raised his hand in the back end, so I wanted to make sure he wanted to weigh in on this. Mickey?
Yeah, just wanted to ask Jeff, so with when it comes to jitter and A to D conversion, since we're oversampling at such a high frequency, is this where accurate or inaccurate clocks come into play and affect the jitter?
Yeah, I think they're more, since everything is oversampled, that's why clocks at the A to D conversion stage are so important. Because remember that when we're actually grabbing our waveform, wherever it is, that point where at that time we grab an amplitude, if that point is out of time, if one of these bars is not equally spaced, it comes early or late. That's clock jitter. And we've grabbed the wrong amplitude at that point. And so that clock jitter in an A to D converter is forever encoded in the audio. We can't get rid of it because we've actually captured the wrong time.
This may be a stupid question, but if on higher frequencies, is that clock jitter more damaging if there are samples coming really fast together as opposed to these nice waveforms that we're looking at, or am I thinking wrong about this?
You're not thinking wrong because the same amount of inaccuracy in jitter, jitter is done as parts per million, but understand that trying to do parts per million at 12 megahertz is harder to do to get 1 part per million than it is at 48 kilohertz.
Cool.
The same amount of time causes more parts per million inaccuracy at 12 megahertz with that really fast clock. But, this is the way audio is always done, is we steal from everybody else, right? We're stealing from computer, we're stealing from medical instruments that are doing this kind of testing. Audio is stolen from video. Anyone who's got bigger budget will steal their technology. And
yes.
Computers have gotten everything to be really fast and will let the math, because the math is accurate. The math is the same every time. An analog filter changes as it warms up because the resistors and capacitors slightly change their values as they warm up or cool down as they age. So doing it in math is much more accurate. All right, so
Marty, do you want to weigh in on this, or do you want to let Jeff go ahead and a little farther before we go take a break?
I just wanted to reference something that Mickey raised about the importance of good clocking, accurate clocking. Is there a point where, so if we have a digital signal chain, signal is passing from one device to another, and each device has an independent clock, I imagine that at some point having an external master clock would be of benefit.
We often hear of those in studios. What's the effect?
Having a good reference clock at the A to D conversion is very important. So jitter is timing inconsistencies in digital transmission. If you're an old analog tape person, you can think about wow and flutter. That's timing inconsistencies. Very different in the digital domain because it doesn't change pitch, but as you're communicating digital audio from one place to another, it will change. It will cause there to be data corruption or data not being received. In conversion from analog to digital, as I said, that's really important because it's about capturing the audio correctly. In the D to A side of things, it's about playing back the audio correctly to make sure that as those samples are reconstructed, that they're equally spaced. In between, we can use PLLs, phase-locked loops, that basically lock onto the average of a clock that may have jitter in it, and so they can remove the jitter. Imagine you are a musician following a conductor who goes slightly up and down in speed. You could follow the average time of that. Or you could click a metronome. You could tap tempo on a metronome, which is now giving you a consistent clock. So, if you look at the way Dante clocking works, it's kind of a little bit crazy when you first look at it because it is using precision time protocol to do its clocking. It's not actually sending a clock signal consistently like the way AES or word clock does. But each device's phase lock loop allows it to remove those jitters. So a good device will not pass jitter along, and it will resolve some amount of jitter. We just don't want there to be jitter when we are converting from analog to digital.
We do have a couple of audience questions in now. Do you want to break for those, or do you have something you want to go immediately to before we get to them?
No, we can go. Yeah.
Okay. Let's dive in. Courtney, what's our first question?
All righty then. First question comes from Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana. He says, so are there harmonics on the bassoon as well as the piccolo flute that will benefit from oversampling? Is it the bit count or the filtering that matters the most for the bassoon?
We have a bassoon fan in the crowd here.
Exactly. I'm a fan
Low
of
frequencies
bassoon.
versus high frequencies, yes.
It's the double reed.
Well, bassoon has some pretty high harmonics, especially if they do multiphonic sounds. Remember that oversampling is not high sampled audio. So this is not, we're not talking about 90 double or quadruple. We're not talking about 96 kilohertz or 192 kilohertz. We're talking about the standard method that all converters use to create 48 kilohertz or 96 kilohertz or 192. So even though we're sampling at these huge rates, we're still only getting out 48 kilohertz audio. So there are no frequencies beyond 24 kilohertz in that digital system that cannot be stored. So if there are harmonics in a bassoon that are at 30 kilohertz, they are gone. And
does that, you have great ears, does that change the timbre, the actual sound? Can you tell the difference if a bassoon has been recorded in one system versus another?
Well, remember, this is not a different system. This is all of our digital audio
This
uses
is everything,
this
yeah.
all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So
would
the
it
fact
hurt
that
a bassoon, I guess, more than a flute in living inside the system?
I don't believe that we need higher sampling rates except for a couple of specific systems. There's nothing interesting audio-wise above 24K. And also,
Your pet
there are
dog
so
might
many other
complain.
things.
Yeah, the dogs are going to be upset.
The dogs will complain. There are so many other things we need to get right about audio before we worry about the frequencies above 24 kilohertz. There are specific cases, if you're going to pitch shift, doing sound effects, those kind of things, that's a great time to use higher sampling rates. But, and again, there are some plugins that do oversampling. And we should talk about that a little bit later too, about why a plugin might upsample, take your 48 kilohertz audio, raise it up 4 or 8 times, do some processing to it, and then decimate it back down to 48 kilohertz.
Courtney, you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to ask, originally A to D converters used to, when they came in with oversampling converters, they used to advertise like 64x oversampling, and now you're saying it's 256x oversampling. If we go back to the 64 times oversampling, does it give you a more accurate bit depth, like 8 bits instead of the 4 bits or 16 values? You get 256 values within that sampling range. Would that give you more accurate dynamics, or are you just compensating for that in the math later on?
Those 64 times were probably 4 or 5 bit converters as well, and they just wanted to improve the dynamic range by going faster. It's
right.
really hard. Original digital audio used straight 48 kilohertz, non-oversampled, and were about 14-bit filters is about the best they could do.
And they used analog filters at that time too, right?
And the analog anti-aliasing filters were the horrible part of it.
Right.
Okay. Do you have another topic
I remember
ready?
those days, yes. That's why everyone
I remember when
objected.
sampling was poor.
When we transitioned between analog and digital, there were a lot of complaints about the harshness, the brittleness, having to do with sample rate and the
the LP vinyl people versus anything digital was
and
massive.
Anti-aliasing filters,
Yeah.
yes.
In those early days. Mickey, you wanted to
So
dive in on this?
the
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, just a question for Jeff. Like with when it comes to the ICs that does this, is this just a common off the shelf IC that the audio hardware manufacturers purchase, or do they typically design this from the ground up for the products that they produce?
No, these are standard chips. Burr Brown, Texas Instruments, all those people will make a chip, and they'll have a selection about oversampling, with 256 being the peak. Really top-end converter manufacturers will begin to do other things. They will stack 2 converters on top of each other. And so they'll do different gain ranges with those, or they'll do try to increase the dynamic range, get a better quality out of them by stacking multiple converters. But if you're stacking 4 converters per channel, you're paying for that in the final product. But if you're talking about something like a Dan Lavery, where you're several $1,000s for a stereo A to D converter, they're going to throw everything they can at it. It becomes the analog input stage becomes very important, the actual circuitry of the analog input stage. Because remember, we need to dither, but usually the noise of the analog input stage is enough to dither if you're talking about 24-bit dynamic range. And then the clock, as we talked about, is really important. And separating those, keeping the digital portion away from the analog portion, physically in the way the IC is laid out, becomes very important to scraping out those last few percentages of dynamic range in these high-end converters.
Circuits are so small you get some crosstalk. Is that what I'm hearing between adjacent?
Yeah. They'll actually have separate ground systems that are only connected in one place, a separate ground plane for the analog stage and a separate ground plane for the digital computer stage. So that digital brick wall filter. This is kind of what we want that to look like. We want unity gain, a little different graph than we're used to seeing for EQ, but this is unity gain in the center, minus infinity, and we want that boy to be as brick wall as possible. So the way this comes up is basically thinking about what the time domain and the frequency domain of different things are. So on the left, you see a sine wave. We know a sine wave is one frequency. And so on the right, you see that there is one frequency here. This is frequency on the right and time on the left. And then some other ones. There's an impulse. So what's an impulse? And it looks like it has energy at every frequency. I will tell you that an impulse cannot actually exist in our world, though it is a conceptual, theoretical thing, because an impulse contains infinite energy. And so if we actually had an impulse, the universe would explode. But if you think about white noise, no, it would not be good. White noise is all frequencies, right? With the same amplitude. But if all of those frequencies are perfectly aligned at one time, and all of their peaks hit the same time, then they cancel each other out at every other time. So an impulse has value at only time zero and no value at other times. It's infinitely short in duration. And if you think about going back to our digital audio, I'm going to go back here to this slide right here. That's just a series of impulses. Again, that's the concept of digital audio once it is written down as numbers. Digital audio is just a series of impulses at different times and at different levels. So what we want, however, is a band-limited impulse. We want an impulse that goes up to from 0 to 24 kilohertz, if we're talking about 48 kilohertz sampling. We want to have all those frequencies and none of the others. So we want a band-limited impulse. And band-limited impulse is this very special waveform called a sync wave. And so that squiggly little thing on the left is an impulse that has had everything above Nyquist removed. It is limited to the frequencies we can have. So if we can take that and substitute it for every single sample, then we can get back to audio. Or in our case, we're actually going to do that for every 256th sample, because we're going to decimate. And we're going to do this digitally. We're going to replace every 256th sample with the sync. So this is essentially the process of convolution, which is taking an impulse response. So a sync is the response when we send an impulse through a perfect digital brick wall filter. Right? And so we're going to basically convolve the response, the sync wave, with the audio, and we do that in a transverse filter, and that's how we decimate this entire thing. So let me see if I have some kind of picture of a transverse filter. Well, here's that sync wave, nicely shown. Now, the problem with that is that's infinitely long, right? Infinitely far future, infinitely far past. So we can't do it exactly perfectly, but we can do it pretty well. And the more closely we represent it, then the better this is going to be. So I don't know if anybody is a Pro Tools person and they've looked at the sample rate conversion in Pro Tools, and it gives you 5 choices from like good, better, best, excellent, and the last one's called tweakhead. And what that does is it's basically you're choosing how much of this sync wave, this impulse response of a band limiting filter, how much of this do you want to actually represent? So Tweakhead is a really, really long version of it, using lots of it, but not the whole thing because it's infinite. We can't ever do the entire thing. We could do perfect brick wall limiting. However, it would take forever for that to happen, so we choose not to do that. This is why good conversion has latency, because in the decimation down from oversampled to normal 48K 24-bit audio, where we've had to remove digitally those frequencies, we have to go through this digital decimation, digital brick wall filter. That takes time because we have to represent both the before and after portions of this sync wave. And this goes through this thing that's called a transverse FIR, finite impulse response filter. And basically, this looks crazy, but it's just math. You put the coefficients in there of the sync wave, and the audio comes in. Can I zoom in on this? No, I cannot. So let's just do that. The audio comes in here, and each of those Z minus 1 is just one oversampled sample in time. And they just, every time it chunks over, and it does math. It multiplies it by the coefficient, and it adds them all up and sends them out. Yeah, and actually we only have to do the math every 256 times because we're also decimating. We're coming down from 12 megahertz down to 48 kilohertz.
Courtney, do you want to make a comment, or do you want? I
was just wondering, in the decimation process, are those samples discarded or are they averaged? You achieve the mean mathematically.
Each of the 256 oversampled samples is part of the calculation.
So those values are included, but they're just summed and averaged then.
Yep.
Yep.
And in that process, we remove ultrasonic stuff.
Taking the stuff in between. Right.
Jeff, do you want to move on or answer another question? We've got a couple more that have come in. Your choice.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let's go. Courtney, can you read the next question?
Sure.
We'll get Douglas.
Douglas Carmichael says, with a low-pass filter before the A to D, can that affect the sound of the higher-pitched instruments like flutes?
Yes, especially in the early days of digital audio, when we weren't doing oversampling, that anti-alias low-pass filter, which was a very difficult analog filter to build, extremely complicated, that definitely did affect high frequencies. And that's why people thought digital audio sounded, brittle and harsh, because in the process of trying to become flat, it actually had some bumps that right before you got to 20, 24 kilohertz, it boosted those frequencies before they cut. And we know that filtering also does all kinds of things to time. So that messes everything up. So if we can do it digitally, we can do it much more accurately than we can in the analog domain.
Plus, obviously, a lot of those early days problems with digital audio have been solved, and we've got fast enough systems and things like that because people listen to these now all day long and are very satisfied with the results.
So while we're there, let's think about, so this has all been about A to D conversion. And I don't care what you have. If you have a $99 Focusrite Scarlett box, it's using oversampled A to D conversion because they just buy the chip and it's there and it's ready to go. And it's an infinitely better way. This solves the problem of early digital audio, and every system uses this. It does add slight more latency. That is a problem. Also, in the D to A conversion, when we go back to analog, same thing. We take our 48 kilohertz audio and we shove a bunch of zeros in between. So now we make it 12 megahertz audio. We just inject other samples in it. We can figure out what those samples are with the sin x over x curve. And it doesn't change our audio. We just know what the other points are. And then we go into a very simple D to A converter because we don't need to do a great anti-alias filter again. So oversampling also gets used in plugins. Now the question is, when do we need it? Well, anytime we're going to have anything that creates harmonics above Nyquist, then we need to worry about those frequencies. So anything that basically squares off the wave. So remember, a square wave is all kinds of harmonics. Somewhere I have a cool animation of a square wave.
It sounds pretty nasty too, if I recall correctly.
So let's see if this is working. There you go. So there you see the first, the fundamental at the top, and then the square wave is all odd harmonics. And you see that as we add the third and the fifth and the seventh, we begin to see something that looks like a square wave. Here's another view of that. This little GIF shows several harmonics of a square wave. So as we square off waves, as we add these extra harmonics, some of those will be beyond the Nyquist frequency. So there you just see that's the interesting way to look at a square wave. We see the harmonic sequence there. So if we do limiting will will limit the peaks and will turn nice smooth curves into something a little bit squared off. If we do distortion will add harmonic components. So plugins that do that can really benefit from upsampling. Take your 48 kilohertz audio, within the plugin, upsample it, say 8 times, and then do the processing, and then do a proper digital brick wall filter at 24 kilohertz to prevent those harmonics from aliasing. If you don't do that, you can get these aliasing components back in your audio.
So you can do that without and still preserve the nastiness of that gritty amped sound, like a fuzz filter, let's say, on a guitar, which just adds clipping basically by overdriving.
Yeah, you're preserving that without adding in additional non-harmonic distortions, because the aliasing
frequencies down beyond in the audible.
Right, the aliasing frequencies will be they're not randomly related, but remember that aliasing happens by folding the audio back over. So if you have 24 kilohertz Nyquist frequency, 25 will come out as 23, 26 will come out as 22. 30 will come out as 18. 40 will come out as 8, right? 8 kilohertz. If you put in 47 kilohertz, it'll come out as 1K. You put in 49 kilohertz, it'll come out as 1K. So all of those aliased frequencies will not have the nice harmonic relationship of the fuzz tone you're talking about. So the distortion has a certain relationship. That's the even and odd harmonics, and usually the ones we like are even, and the ones that are nasty are odd. So like tubes and analog tape, those tend to have more even harmonic distortion. But aliasing doesn't have that nice relationship because it has the fold-back nature to it. So it's really bizarre sounding, and so we want to keep that out, and that's what oversampling in these plugins does. The other thing that oversampling is used for is to do metering of intersample peaks. So if there are two sample points that are right at maximum, there could be a peak in between the two of those. And so by oversampling and recreating the waveform in there, we can read what the actual level of that was.
So it kind of interpolates the missing portion of the waveform. Yeah.
Not missing, but it does... Right?
Estimate.
That waveform's not missing, it's only represented by those few points. But in order for the meter to figure it out, we need to find a few more points if it went higher there.
Do you want to do the last?
That's the counterintuitive thing of digital audio is that just because we're only dealing with sample points, there's nothing actually missing. That's just the representation. And that representation is absolutely adequate enough and cannot be any more perfect as long as you take care of Nyquist. As long as we're only talking about frequencies from 0 to 24 kilohertz, 48 kilohertz is perfectly adequate, and any more does not improve anything.
I'm curious about this. In my earlier days, to get good audio, you had to really go up the ladder to get better quality equipment that was built to better specifications. It seemed to me like there are now a lot of modestly expensive tools that promise, I'm not saying they deliver completely accurate, but promise good audio quality digitally at almost ridiculously low prices. That seem like it might be a reflection of this, that the algorithms and everything else in this process is kind of known, and they can now reproduce these in mass, and you can get a lot of inexpensive gear that is okay digitally in terms of recording and playback because of this. Am I accurate in that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there used to be a huge difference between, well, there was no entry-level digital audio. There was no entry-level audio. And now the cheapest piece of equipment is great. The big difference is in the analog stages. So the mic preamp, the line output, and then transducers, speakers, and microphones. Those are where the big difference.
It's not that there isn't a high level of manufacturing and quality control that still has to happen to make a reliable piece of gear that lasts forever. But sometimes you buy these little things and you go, "Wow, that sounds fabulous! I'm really shocked," and this makes sense out of all that for me.
Yeah. A to D conversion is literally an off-the-shelf chip, and the math, the code for this is very well known and taught in engineering schools. So where you get the tougher tweaks is building a good mic preamp and putting the actual component quality into that. The component quality of digital doesn't matter. That's what we've done in digital is we've removed the quality of the audio from the quality of getting the numbers from one place to another. If you get the numbers, you've got the quality. Whereas in analog, you have to get the waveform there with certain qualities, so every component matters.
But that front end where you're sampling off a highly well-built microphone to great tolerances versus something that's sloppy and doesn't do a very good job, that's going to go through the whole chain the way it initially got recorded. Okay, that makes sense. Mickey, you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I guess this goes back to what Jeff mentioned earlier, wherein the math is perfect. It's just you have to make sure that the information you input into the math is of good quality.
Garbage
and that
in,
includes
garbage out.
Yeah, exactly. That includes things like the clock, the ICs, the off-the-shelf ICs that do this need an accurate clock, and if you don't feed it that, then the math will, as you mentioned, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, makes sense. Courtney, you wanted to hop in on this?
Related to what Mickey was just talking about, I have a question about the A to D clock, the signal that is clocking the oversampled A to D converter. Is that a crystal-controlled oscillator, and does its frequency have to be tied to the word clock of the digital transmission if you're going to be sending that stuff around your studio digitally with a word clock signal? Is that word clock derived from the A to D clock, or do they have nothing to do with each other?
Absolutely everything to do with each other. So the 256 sample clock for the oversampling is exactly 256 times the word clock, and it is created from it. And that's extraordinarily simple device to build to do that up clock and down clock. I mean, that's like kind of like engineering sophomore level projects. They build things to convert clock from one to another. So that's really easy components.
Let's knock out our last question, then we can just talk until everybody gets tired of talking, until Jeff gets tired of explaining things.
Excuse the helicopter. From Rayon Smith in Trinidad, West Indies, he says, is there any online website or course to learn these variables? If not, can we work on an online course?
A small
Jeff,
thing for a volunteer group.
For
Yeah, let's do some world-class training production here and not get paid for it. Jeff, what do you think?
I guess it's called office hours, and it's here every Wednesday for the audio portion of it. That's a good question. I would have to look into that. This has been decades of study and also practical use and talking to people. And that's interesting. Interesting question. There's a couple of questions actually in the chat that we may want to tackle here, but I'll let Marty go ahead for this one first.
No, I did take a look at Wikipedia, and I looked up oversampling, and it came up with a bunch of really good, informative information, as well as some links to a couple of related topics such as anti-aliasing and that kind of thing. So there was some really good information there. And I'm sure that other educators have produced some YouTube videos that would explain this in a more graphical sense. So, those are some good resources. I don't know if there are any courses online that you could, pay for or subscribe to, but that along with the information that Jeff just imparted upon us and those other resources, so we can get a pretty good understanding of it.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. I mean, if nothing else, it always reminds me how much these simple things that we use every day, behind the scenes, there's tremendous amounts of complexity that have taken generations of engineering to build into something that we can go buy now for 99 cents at Walmart. Not 99 cents maybe, but $7.99 for a little digital playback unit. Let's see. That takes care of all that. Jeff, did you have anything else you wanted to talk about before we finish up for today?
So Roscoe asked in the chat, what's the difference between an impulse and a sample? An impulse, again, is a theoretical waveform that has value at time zero. It has level at time zero and has no level at all other times. So anytime you see, this is on the left side here, we're looking at a waveform, and anytime you see a sharp corner, right, it's impossible, if you tried to represent this in a speaker, it's impossible for a speaker to be sitting at rest, jump out
100%,
and then jump back instantaneously. That just can't happen.
Zero rise time.
Speaker wouldn't like it either.
The speaker would not like it either. So that's an impulse. And then a sample is, once we've sampled audio, we have a series of impulses, or what engineers would call an impulse train. So that's a series of impulses. And if you look at the spectrum, you see that an impulse train looks like its spectrum because it has harmonics that are at multiples of the sampling frequency. And then when you modulate this impulse train with the audio, that the audio makes the impulse train go up and down in level, now you're back to this waveform right here. There is an impulse train that is modulated by the audio, and those are samples.
So I think a balloon pop might be as close as we can come to a theoretical impulse, right?
Balloon pop or a starter pistol, is what's commonly used for capturing impulse responses for convolution reverbs. That's as close as we can get. But thankfully, a balloon pop doesn't make the universe explode.
There's that sound that always scares me. It sounds like a square wave, that horrible, raspy sound that when you hear it, you immediately want to pot things down to zero because the speakers are just dying. Is that? I'm trying to get my mind around the fact that
if you
zero time.
Analog SMPTE time code into an amplifier speaker, that's what it says.
Yeah.
Well, I always think of it as digital clipping.
Clapping your hands or a slapstick is, something that's extraordinarily short.
Yeah.
That's about as close as we get to an impulse. Again, an impulse does not exist in our world. It is a theoretical concept. But again, a sine wave is a theoretical concept because we listen to sine waves all the time, but those are not actually sine waves because truly a sine wave started infinitely in the past and goes infinitely in the future. It is continuous forever.
So you're just hearing a little tiny bit of the continuum of
we are hearing a windowed sine wave.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it gets really crazy.
Unless there's anything else we want to chat about, maybe this is a good point to finish up. Thank you all who have been paying attention to, and thank you as always, Jeff. I come to these Wednesdays really looking forward to it because I know I will come out not really knowing that much more than I knew before because this is way above my pay grade in terms of complexity, but at least feeling more familiar. And I know many of you in the audience who have better math skills and better physics skills than I do will come away with actual knowledge from this. So we truly appreciate it, Jeff, you taking the time to turn this into something that we can all understand and benefit from. And for those of you who want careers in audio or in the audio portion of video, this is the kind of thing you're going to be dealing with as you go up the ladder and get into the highly, more and more responsibility on your shoulders. You're seeing a look into the science, the physics, the electrical engineering, and the rest of these things that behind and prop up and make real all of the things that we enjoy when we listen to a great music performance, particularly one that's been recorded and played back for our enjoyment. It's a fabulous thing. So thank you all for being here today. Let's see. Nothing really to report other than the fact that the Tulloch Traversal yet. If you'd wanted to do this, not only would we have had to go visit Jeff Francis, but we would have had to travel all over the place. And for the questions that we got from people, we would have had to travel even farther. Our Tulloch Traversal today, 36,000 miles. That's 58,000 kilometers and 286 million bananas for scale. Don't forget about the shirts if you want a shirt. Don't forget about the fact that after hours happens all the time, even when we're on the air. And don't forget on Monday we have the extra hours and things like that. So we'll see you tomorrow.
I always thought that oversampling is when I went to the Caesar's Palace buffet and took a little bit too much of everything. I was a victim of oversampling, yes.
Yeah, I think that's all you can eat. They make the offer. You have to do the oversampling.
Every once in a while, you'll find that brick wall filter at the buffet line.
Yes,
you should.
Just
I'm
don't
married
find
to
it
one.
with
It's
your
named
car.
Linda, and God bless her.
I'm sorry, you visited the buffet one too many times.
For keeping my signal-to-noise and food ratio under control.
To anti-alias you. Yes.
That's right.
All right.
Always fun. Thank you all. Look forward to next Wednesday when we come back and do it again.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Jeff. Really, seriously,
Ciao.
thank you.